Farewell.
Yes, it's my 80th birthday.
Oh, you're not going anywhere. Are you?
Yes, dear. I took the tablets an hour ago. I'll be gone by midnight.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedman.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. No one chooses to be born, but what about choosing when and how we die? A new novel by today's guest explores this question and what it means for the loved ones left behind.
We're happy to talk with Eric Beck Rubin, an author and academic whose new novel is 10 Clear Days. Eric, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you for the invitation.
10 Clear Days began as a memoir, but became a novel. What caused that shift?
A memoir is this inevitably, at least I think inevitably, a mix of fact and fiction, and it's not quite clear where one ends and the other begins. And even if that's just using the rules of fiction, creating narrative structure, you're crossing a certain line. And for me, at least, memoir has a tinge of fraudulence to it, in the sense that, personally speaking, at least, I grew up in the time of James Frey and Stephen Glass and Jason Blair, and not to say that those writers who lied about telling the truth were somehow groundbreaking in that field. I think there have been fraudulent memoirs for as long as there have been memoirs, but it didn't sit well with me, and I wanted not to be hung up in those questions. So I went to the realm of fiction, where I can be more certain about the things that I'm trying to say, the ways that I'm trying to say them, and not worry about whether I'm being accurate or truthful in the conventional sense.
I mean, even Mark Twain, or maybe especially Mark Twain, was very, let's say, colorful in his reconstruction of his life and his autobiography. I think there's also something that's kind of self-indulgent about a memoir that isn't the case when you're writing a novel.
Oh, no, I don't agree with that. I mean, you could think of so many self-indulgent novels, but it's self-indulgent in another way. I mean, the way that a writer can abuse their readers by just going on and on about things that are really only of interest to the writer themselves, or in a way that ceases to engage with the reader entirely. But having said that, and the memoir invites you and almost does not let you leave the party of self-indulgence. And at the end of not at the end of the day, the beginning of the day, it's not my story. It's not my story, 10 Clear Days. It's a story about my grandmother.
Your novel is the first to take readers through the final stages of pursuing the right to die. How would you summarize the book, which was, as noted, taken from real life?
In August 2018, my grandmother, who was 83 at the time, had a heart attack and a stroke the same night, taken to the hospital, had a DNR, was operated on nonetheless, woke up the next day, was told, "You're going to make it." And her first and abiding reaction was, "Why am I still here? There was a DNR." And she asked for what was at the time relatively new procedure in Canada, at least new legally speaking. It's called medical assistance in death, MAID. And the doctor who was there said, "Yeah, you can ask that, but you're not a candidate because you're going to get better. You're not a candidate." And my grandmother just said, she didn't say, but she gave a look that said, "You may very well think that. You may very well be right," which is her way of saying, "You may very well be wrong." That was just her manner of speaking. And she asked, and then the doctor submitted to the request. The other doctors came in, the maid doctors, and they started a clock, 10 days, during which those doctors would decide. Now, when she asked, there were all of us in the room. By all of us, I mean her children, her grandchildren, not every last one of us, but many of us. And I can't say it was exactly half, but roughly half of us had a sense this was coming and were behind her. And the other half may or may not have had a sense that it was coming, but we're not behind her. So during that 10 days, we see all these forces acting against each other, with my grandmother at the center, saying very, very little. That's half the story. The other half, and it's these two halves that play up in each chapter. The other half is the first 40 years of her life, which began just before the war in a suburb of Budapest. Included her survival of the war in hiding, included her suddenly leaving Budapest for Vienna, suddenly leaving Vienna for North America, and starting this life here, which was in many ways an amazing life, but in a place she never wanted to be. So in the other half, we're looking at these 40 years and asking, how did she come to this shocking request?
Did those family tensions persist after the events of the book as well?
They persist to this day. Speaking very frankly, I would say everybody in the family, well, I don't have to say it. Everybody in the family was happy I was able to publish this book, but not everybody's happy that the book is out there. Part of that is because MAID is called in some circles medically assisted suicide, because suicide is counter to Jewish custom, Jewish law. Some of it is just the taboo that exists around MAID, because it is, if not adjacent, well, if not suicide itself, then seen as adjacent to it. So yeah, that's those tensions persist, and it was published just a couple weeks ago here. I wonder how long they'll last.
So, zooming out for a second on what you said, the title of your book refers to Canada's mandatory 10-day reflection period for medical assistance in dying. Could you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's MAID as it was legislated in 2018. There's MAID as it was practiced in my grandmother's case in 2018. And there's MAID as it is legislated and practiced today. And not one of them is like the other. And it's fascinating to me how much discrepancy there is between all these things. For example, one of the early readers of this book happened to be a doctor who was on rotation at Sunnybrook Hospital, where my grandmother was, in the MAID department, which had taken on this case. And she said, well, this must have happened, that must have happened. I said, no, those things did not happen. The 10-day waiting period, for example, is no longer, as I understand, is no longer in effect. It's a completely different process. But in my grandmother's case, which I think is a question, this is what happened. She made the request, and the doctors initiated this 10 clear day waiting period. And that term, clear day, refers to a day that starts at 12 midnight. So my grandmother makes this request. Her first thought is, but you can do it right away. They say, no, it's 10 days. And she says, 10 days, that's next Wednesday. And they say, well, actually, no, it's next Thursday because it's 10 clear days. And every time she would ask them, and she would put on all her charm, which was considerable, even in the hospital, even in her hospital gown. She was very forceful as a personality, but also very sweet in her delivery. And she kept trying to whittle that 10-day period. So that 10 days was for her, not for her to think about. It was really for doctors to examine. Was she certain? So it was really a test of her resolve. And was she lucid? Was she thinking clearly? And the 10 days was also a time for us as a family, though this was not the intention, I don't think, It was a time for us as a family to reflect on our relationship with our grandmother, which is a very clinical way of putting our love of our grandmother, our memories of our grandmother, and also this thing that we're facing, which even for those who were behind my grandmother, is extremely scary.
It's almost like sitting Shiva for someone who hasn't died yet.
The alternative title. It is like that in that one of the things that strikes me about Shiva is that it really wrings you out. Like 7 days, you are so wiped out by the end. You are so drained. It's excessive in some ways, or it feels excessive. Afterwards, it may not have felt like enough. But at the time, again, this meal, these people, these prayers, this room, and by the last days is something I describe in the novel. We're talking about riddles. We're talking about the speed of light. We're talking about songs, music. We've gone to like a place where it did not. If you were to think of people in a room mourning in advance, you wouldn't think of them going to these seemingly tangential places. But we did. We were outside time. Like that's how it felt. We were outside time. At that moment, I had a 4-month-old daughter, and I had been attached to her on this particular schedule for the initial months of her life, changing, feeding, sleeping, napping, walking. And all that stopped for that 10-day period. Yeah, it was taken outside time, and Shiva's like that as well. Like everything that's going on just stops. I really I appreciate that interpretation.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
Your doctoral dissertation dealt with Holocaust fiction spanning 3 generations and how these works go from being radical to more conservative over time. What sort of things did you notice?
The fiction to describe that trajectory. Well, one of the things I noticed, and I can give you a concrete example. I can think of the time or the book and the place that I noticed it, was that those who had been witnesses could say things that non-witnesses could never, not only never say, never even contemplate saying. So the example that I was thinking of just now comes from a book called Fatelessness. The author is Imre Kertész. He's a Hungarian writer. He was taken to the camps when he was 14 years old. And he writes about his experience that it was in lieu of his teenage years, in lieu of his entry into adulthood, in lieu of his education. That was what the camps were for him. And when he leaves those camps, when he is liberated, when he's free, when he goes back to the regular world, he finds that nobody grasps what he has experienced. That in itself is not radical or new. But what he says next, I would say, shocked me. And I think would shock anybody who read it. He said he misses it. He missed that world because that's where he was most himself. Those were what he called like the golden years of his youth. That's extremely fucked up. And that's not to say it's not true. It's I describe it like that because it shakes me up. Even thinking about it, it's hard to even say the words. I feel I don't have the authority to say them. Only he does, which is kind of what I'm saying in the dissertation. Those who live through it can see things in it that we can't see, can say things that we cannot say. And over time, the loss of that authority meant that the story that was so broad in the minds of those who had survived and witnessed just becomes narrower and narrower and narrower as people who are our age can say less, have less authority. I think that's changing with the loss of witnesses. We no longer feel them looking over our shoulder. I'd say that has, in theory, meant that the field is opened up. I'd say in practice, it's meant a lot of people are saying a lot of outrageous things, false things, because there's nobody there to correct that record. And that's been going on for quite a while. I'd say it's exploded recently.
The Holocaust looms in the background of your novel. Why was it important to recount that aspect of your grandmother's past?
My grandmother was just turned 9 in February 1944. The Germans came in about a month later, actually a couple weeks after her birthday. For what I call in the dissertation a direct witness, somebody who was there, not somebody who was in hiding. And it's not a hierarchy, it's just a distinction. For a direct witness, I think that the Holocaust is at the center of their life forever. For an indirect witness, somebody who is in hiding, I think it's similarly at the center of their life. And for anyone who comes afterwards, it can be a very important factor in their life. It can be something that they dedicate themselves to, which they dedicate themselves. It's never going to be at the center. It's never going to be the thing that is tied to almost everything that follows afterwards, that you cannot displace. My grandmother could not, and I don't think ever sought to displace those experiences, and they were formative. She told me many stories. The thing that's coming to mind right now as an example is that she, as a child, remembers looking in the mirror and trying to find the face of a Jew in the mirror, because she had seen in the paper, this is what a Jew looks like. Ugly, hook-nosed, thick-lipped, sneering, oleaginous, not quite human beings. And she looked in the mirror as a child, 6, 7, 8, and she thought, where is that person? Where is that person? How is that person me? She's not saying I'm not that person. She's making the connection. That's when she's still a child. It's unimaginable to form one's idea of oneself in such a world and then just leave it behind at some future date. And it's not like the world was letting her leave it behind either. Not to say that it was all quite so intense and drastic as it was in her early years, but it was never far away.
I know that a lot of direct witnesses, survivors, chose not to speak much about their experiences. Did you find that your grandmother was a little more open in that regard?
I have one survivor among all my grandparents. I don't know how to compare it to others along a range, for example. But I do know, like you said, that there are those who spoke and those who did not. I can compare it to a person I spoke with for my dissertation. It's a wonderful gentleman. And he said his children didn't ask him, and he didn't want to speak about it. And then when his grandchildren asked him, that's when he started to speak about it. I don't think my grandmother ever didn't speak about it. I know she had children who were interested. Let me rephrase that. I know that my grandmother didn't ever tuck it away or hide it. She spoke to her children about it. It was the central story of her life. And so when she talked to us as grandchildren, well, I'm speaking about me and my brothers, I don't know the experience of my cousins. She spoke to us about it as well. We didn't ask to hear about it. We were just told about it, and I feel very fortunate for that, actually.
In the book, your grandmother is often referred to as the patient, which for me created a fascinating rhetorical distance within a very intimate story. How did you arrive at that device?
So that goes a bit to the first question about memoirs. So initially I was writing this story trying to capture this whole world that my grandmother created, really for, I mentioned my 4-month-old daughter, for her. That was a motivation. For others, yes, but I kept thinking, this was a person who was so important in my life. My daughter had gotten to be with her, but not in an age she'll remember. What can I tell her? It felt very urgent. And I was having trouble telling this story in a way that would matter to anybody else. Like, you used the word inside baseball before we were talking. It felt like inside baseball. Like, I could describe to the nth degree the tablecloths, the chairs, the expressions, the garden, the traditions, but it wasn't cohering into anything that mattered to anybody but myself. And I realized that in order to write about my grandmother, I could still call her Granny as a character, but as a writer, I'd have to call her Mary Beck, Mrs. Beck, the patient, so as to see her, so as to understand her relationship to a reader, an initially disinterested reader, and so as to understand her relationship to us and her family in a way that really opened up the story, because all of a sudden I was writing about a person, and not just this person who was like, sorry, so that all of a sudden, let me get this right. It opened up the story in the sense that I could write about a fully formed character, all these different aspects of her, as opposed to this character who almost lived inside me that I could barely describe. That was a big decision, and it made the novel possible.
I think there's also, just from my perspective as a reader, when she's called patient, it sort of reminds me that this is a very medical context, that even though there are all these stories going on, these interactions that are very much intimate, as I mentioned, and very emotional, like it's all taking place in this very sterile, cold, somewhat uncaring environment, which is a hospital.
Emotionally, I am too close to that hospital, or rather, I'm more comfortable in that hospital. I wouldn't say I'm emotionally sterile, but other people might. I would say that I'm cold, or too prone to the rational as opposed to the other approaches to situations. But that's where I, that's where I'm myself, for better, for mostly worse. Um, there's another thing though, and that is that my view is that to really get into a book is to go on a journey. And what I mean more specifically by that is to walk a distance between yourself and the story that you're engaging with. And I have this belief, difficult as it is, that the longer the journey you make, the more you invest in the book. So if I withhold the obvious emotional cues, you supply them as the reader. The more you give to the story, the more the story means to you. That's my experience of reading. That's the way I prefer to write.
I was thinking, yeah, it's both like a very audacious approach, but also I think a pretty effective one. I mean, I think it took me on a journey, honestly. Um, I had to read it in a few sittings, and yeah, I mean, I was pretty emotional by the end of it. I mean, it kind of reminded me of experiences that I've had, and in other ways was also sort of different. I'm also sort of wondering about writing it from the perspective of a, what do they call it? The medical record officer, which I'm somewhat familiar with from charting. And I'm wondering, w- you know, what was research like for that? Or was that did that give you a little literary license to go with it? I don't know, like that kind of, it felt like that the narrator was both very present and also very absent throughout the story.
Wow, that's first of all, thank you very much. I I'm laughing because I appreciate the idea that he has a paradoxical effect. That's what that's one of the things I would hope he would have. Um, yeah, it's in some ways the novel reads like a fantasia of a doctor's chart. The research was simple. My father, almost every weekend that I can remember growing up, was sitting at the desk, charts in front of him, dictating into a dictaphone. Patient is, patient presents with, patient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's a rheumatologist. And so that's what was playing in my mind for this character that I completely made up. Um, and yeah, I made him up, yes, so that I have license, but also in reference to the last answer I gave, so that I could tell the story as myself, but at a distance. And so that I wasn't constantly dealing with this character, Eric. And there is an Eric character in the book, and it's basically me. But I wasn't cheating. The author character allowed me, again, a distance from everyone in the family so that I could see them all clearly, myself included. I wanted to be part of the story, but if I was also telling the story, it felt like I was playing too many, it felt like playing a card trick, and I didn't want to do that. So I just put myself to the side, and I made the author the central narrator. Of course, there's a play there too, because I'm the author of the novel. So it gets kind of goes back and forth with who this author character is. And there's deliberately some mystery about that. But as a device, it is to get away from the family and to look at it as objectively as possible, at least in the beginning stages, before he himself gets more emotionally drawn into the story.
Have your experiences and maybe writing this book affected your views of medical assistance in dying?
Yes, I used to have an agnostic view towards it. My view was that it is humane for those who need it. And while the psychiatric community seems very split, well, was split when it was created, and seems even more divided as its scope has broadened to include people of different ages, people of different diseases, people at different stages of their disease. I thought in the case of my grandmother, what was a humane thing to do to offer that, or it would be a humane thing to do to offer that. However, not that I feel so strongly that I would go to the barricades on this one, but there is an element of made that does not sit well with me, and that is when it is offered to those who ought to be better taken care of before they are given that option. People who are homeless, people suffering from PTSD, veterans, for example. It's it's difficult to see the expansion of MAID and not think of it as reckless in some cases. But then I want to go back to this, which is my final point on my thinking, and something that the book, I believe, is saying, which is to understand whether to offer MAID to somebody, you really need to know so much about their life and their story. It is supremely not a one-size-fits-all solution. And yet you have doctors in this country who will perform hundreds of procedures. That's more than one a day. How do they know? How do they know? I put that question out there in the hopes that I get an answer or answers. Not to say it's impossible to know, but I'm genuinely curious. How do they know?
Well, thanks, Eric. You've given us a lot to think about.
Yeah, well, I haven't amused you, though.
Well, you'd be surprised what amuses us.
Yeah, that's dark.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.